Hello, curious cats, and thank you for clicking on the pilot episode of this podcast. I will start it with the story of the person that actually inspired me to make it in the first place, who is Sir John Bertrand Gurdon. The first time I learned about his life was during one of my courses in my master's degree, while I was learning about stem cells. He was born on the 2nd of October 1933 in South England, in a village called Frensham. His mother, Marjorie Byers, was from an East Yorkshire farming family, and his father, William Gurdon, was from a long-standing Suffolk family. Fun fact about this family is that one of the first people that have been written about was Bertrand de Gurdon, or Pierre Basile, he's also known under this name, and who was the person that shot King Edward the Lionheart. And because of this injury, the king will later die, not before he forgave de Gurdon. And this is, in a way, quite funny, because the family motto is Virtus viget in arduis, which is translated into virtue flourishes in adversity. And I'm assuming de Gurdon was not the person that inspired this motto. However, it is quite fitting, in my opinion, when I'll be telling you about Sir John Gurdon and his life. First, let's start at the age of 8, when he was sent to a local private school after a quite uneventful childhood. And here, he was given an intelligence test, during he was asked to draw an orange. And he started to draw the stalk by which the orange would hang from a tree, and his reason behind it was that an orange would not exist in space. The teacher, that obviously lacked any kind of creativity, tore up the piece of paper and reported to his parents that he was mentally subnormal and would need special teaching. And I just felt that this teacher might have just failed the first lesson of being a Brit, and that is being also polite, but here we are. But you know what the teacher meant to say apparently was that the child should have drawn a circle, and the sign of any thinking outside the box was regarded as subnormal or just plain weird. So consequently, his parents, who did not like this kind of feedback on their own child, moved their son to another private school in the same village, which is very interesting. I've never heard of a village to have 2 private schools. And then it seems that even at that age, he developed a keen interest in plants and insects and everything regarded as natural sciences. And in his spare time, he collected butterflies and moths, and he raised their caterpillars as a hobby. Then at 13, he was sent to Eton, which is a boarding school, a very famous one actually. And because Eton School has and had very high standards, and of course being a boarding school and the fact that you as a pupil probably saw your family very seldom, Sir John Gurdon also developed means to survival so he could cope with the environment he was sent to. And because of that, he took up squash as a hobby, and as a result of hard work at squash, he became eventually the school captain. If you don't know what squash me is pretty much a very weird variant of tennis where you play with another person but also with the wall, which I think it gives it an interesting twist. It's quite demanding as well. And also, while he was at school, he continued his interest in Lepidoptera, which is the Latin word for the moths and the butterflies. And he kept raising them in large numbers from their larval stage, just to study them and observe their evolution. Now we come to the point that made me do this episode on him, because when he turned 15, the whole class started to take up science classes. And he got a very interesting report from his science teacher just after one semester of science. And I will read the entire report because it's so deliciously cruel and quite unbelievable. But it says as follows. It has been a disastrous half. His work has been far from satisfactory. His prepared stuff has been badly learned, and several of his test pieces have been torn over. One of such pieces of prepared work scored 2 marks out of possible 50. His other work has been equally bad, and several times he has been in trouble, because he will not listen but will insist on doing his work in his own way. I believe he has ideas about becoming a scientist. On his present allowing, this is quite ridiculous. If he can't learn simple biological facts, he would have no chance of doing the work of a specialist. And it would be sheer amount of wasted time, both on his part and those of who have to teach him. I would assume that most people who would have gotten such a report would be quite discouraged to furtherly study a subject, any for that matter. But as you could probably observe from the report itself, one of the main problems the teacher saw was the fact that John was a very strong-minded pupil who knew what he wanted and wanted to do it himself without the help of others. And from what I can see, reading through the lines, was that he also despised learning facts just for the sake of it. When you put it in parallel with the fact that he was growing Lepidoptera to study them and so on, you can clearly see that he wanted to look past just facts and what he was taught, and he wanted something more meaningful and in depth. But regardless, being told such nasty things in such a direct way, and also your parents having to read it, it could have been a blow to your self-esteem anyway, especially at 15. And on top of that, because of this report, he was prevented from going to science classes again, and he was sent to instead learn Greek and Latin. Also, another reason why he was sent there was because the teachers that were teaching these subjects didn't have enough pupils. So in their heads was kind of like, okay, he doesn't seem smart enough for science, so we're just sending him to learn Greek and Latin. Which, regardless of what point of view you have, I still feel that is quite offensive. But anyway, I digress. Later in an interview, Sir Gurdon said about the teacher that in retrospect was actually a good thing that happened. Because, and I quote, "Other people I've met since were taught by this teacher and they all said he was terrible. I mean, most of the time he was wrong in what he said, factually wrong, and that he taught wrong information. So it was sort of a relief to be no longer under the control of someone who wasn't a good teacher." And I guess, yeah, it's always good to look at the half that's full. But that also meant to learn something that he wasn't inclined to do. And his mother saw that. And she also saw the fact that his interest in science was not dimmed by this experience and feedback. So she decided, like I'm assuming any other good mother would do, to help her son to pursue his actual passion. And so it seems, because again we need to remember that his family was actually in a influential circle because of their upbringing and their ancestry. It happened that she knew a professor of zoology at Oxford, and she asked him what can it be done in order for him to start pursuing science again. And she also asked him if he could maybe accept him at Oxford for a biological degree for university. And the professor said, well, just take him off of schoolwork for a year and help him study hard for the science exam that was given at the University of Oxford in order for him to pass and to get into an undergraduate degree. And this is exactly what he ended up to do. For a whole year, he intensely crammed chemistry, biology, and physics. And in the end, he got into zoology at Oxford. About his experience at Oxford was maybe comparable in a sense that he later said they were just learning facts and there was no encouragement towards critical and analytical thinking. But undergrad came and passed, and finally he was able to apply for a PhD position where he would actually be able to shine and develop his analytical skills. He initially wanted to pursue a PhD in entomology. You know, remember his old passions for so long on insects. But the funny part was that during his undergrad, while pursuing his hobby of studying insects, he discovered a species in the natural reserve of the university. And the professor of entomology at Oxford was really unhappy about it because he kind of took his shine by discovering that new species. And because unfortunately intelligent people can also be very petty, he denied Gurdon a place in his department for a PhD. As a retort, Sir Gurdon said, and I quote, "That was quite right because he wasn't a very good entomologist anyway." And I must confess, throwing academic shade, this is what I live for. It's beautiful. But indeed, it turned out to be for the better. Again, because he got accepted as a PhD candidate under Dr. Michael Fishberg, who is a very famous developmental biologist. And he was a great role model and mentor for Gurdon. And he started his PhD in 1956. Now, let's take a step back and see exactly what were the actual questions that were going around in the scientific community when it came to developmental biology at that point. It was still a very young area of science. And one of the most interesting questions and also prominent in those days was whether the cells that form the different tissues and organs possess only the genes they need or the whole genome. So the thinking was that, maybe the embryo has all the genes, but during the whole differentiation of the cells, maybe they lose some and then they know exactly what they are. They get the new identity. And previous experiments in which researchers took a nucleus of one type of cell and transferred it to another type of cell that was lacking its nucleus. They observed after those experiments that the receiver cell turned into a giver cell type. So in their mind, they concluded that once a cell has differentiated, it loses part of its genome. And as we know now, it's completely untrue. But this is the year 1956 for you. So Gurdon, who was a master by now by, proving wrong people in general, he embarked into this quest of testing if that hypothesis was indeed true. And he did that by studying the Xenopus eggs, which is a type of frog. During his PhD, he did some interesting experiments, and he finished in 1960. But unfortunately, the evidence he collected was not enough to convince the whole scientific community, that every cell, regardless of type, contained the whole genome. So later he pursued a postdoc at Caltech, and this is when he did one of his most famous research papers. And in 1962, Gurdon transferred the nucleus from an intestinal cell of a tadpole into an unfertilized frog's egg. Now, if you would have gone with the old hypothesis, then of course, if you take the nucleus from an intestinal cell and put it into another cell that was lacking any type of genetic material, that meant that receiver cell will turn into an intestinal cell. But lo and behold, the egg with the replaced nucleus matured into a complete tadpole. And then, in order to give his experiments and his findings even more strength in a way, Gurdon has sought out donor frogs with visible mutations to demonstrate that the new frogs were, in fact, descended from the donor tadpole. So he selected tadpoles for a particularly dramatic experiment. And these tadpoles came from albino frogs, and the egg came from a dark-colored frogs. And then when he got the results, the photographs with these frogs were widely circulated, because you could clearly see that you had the dark frog and then her albino progeny. And this experiment attracted intense attention from all his colleagues. So he finally proved that no, the nucleus never loses parts of its genome. When the cell differentiates, there are just other mechanisms that maybe silence parts of it. So one cell can become into a very specialized cell. And of course, later these mechanisms will be unraveled, but it was paramount to understand the basic principle of what is happening inside of a differentiating cell. Also very important, his nuclear transfer techniques are still in use today, and his findings conclusively showed that the nucleus of any cell contains the whole genome. However, although these are really striking findings, the results ignited a groundbreaking scientific discovery only 30 years after this. And this takes us to the highest peak of Sir Gurdon's career. After his postdoc, he got a place at Oxford as a professor. And then he was knighted by the Queen and became Sir John Bertrand Gurdon as a appreciation for all his scientific discoveries. But in 2012, he actually was awarded the Nobel Prize. And he shared this prize with Shinya Yamanaka, who is a Japanese researcher. In their interview for the Nobel Prize, they explain how this happened, and I found it a very interesting story. Because you remember the paper I just told you about, published in 1962. This paper will actually inspire Yamanaka. Also a fun fact, I digress, but Yamanaka was born in the same year as when the paper was published. Coincidence? I believe not. Maybe papers take human forms sometime. Although I hope mine doesn't, because that would be one ugly kid. Anyway. So Yamanaka has initially trained as an orthopedic surgeon, but later changed his mind and transitioned to being a scientist. Because let's be honest, who wants to deal with feet all their lives? At first he was involved in research regarding atherosclerosis, which is translated into clogged arteries pretty much. And he discovered the gene that was thought to be involved in this disease. However, it turned out it was actually associated with cancer. So this made him change the focus of his research. And then later on discovered another gene thought to be linked with cancer, but actually it was linked to embryonic stem cells. And this again shifted his interest. But the problem with studying embryonic stem cell is that they are surrounded by ethical and moral issues, which makes research really cumbersome. So Yamanaka was thinking, is there maybe another way to surpass these issues? And then he stumbled on Sir Gurdon's 1962 paper on nuclear reprogramming, and a light was switched in Yamanaka's head. What if you could reprogram an adult cell, for example, a patient or just a person in general, into reacquiring the stemness capacity? So the difference is that embryonic stem cell have this capacity of differentiating in any type of cell. So what if you don't need to bother with all that ethical issues and moral and so on, and you can just take one cell or cells in general from someone and then turn back time for them, reteach them how to be stem cells again. And he decided to pursue this idea. He was very determined to get to the bottom of it. And it took him 13 years to discover the transcription factors that were able to trigger this reprogramming of the adult cells. They started with 24 candidates, and through trial and error, good team, techniques, and as always in science, a dash of luck, they managed to narrow it down to 4 essential factors that would properly get the job done. And they named these cells induced pluripotent cells, because you can induce this capacity of differentiating into different types of cell again. When asked in the Nobel interview in 2012, Yamanaka suggested that this breakthrough will lead to great medical technologies, which, considering the developments now 10 years later, it seems that he was quite right. And I'm pretty sure we haven't seen the best of it yet. So, because he was greatly inspired by Sir Gurdon's paper, and he also applied the same techniques and so on, part of them, they will later share the Nobel Prize. And I feel that this is very commendable. What I appreciated when Sir Gurdon was also asked about the importance of this discovery, he emphasized the importance of understanding the basic mechanisms that govern the cell before asking the selfish questions of how this will help humanity. And I feel that he was quite right. Maybe sometimes we just need to be curious, and that is enough. And, sometimes the selfishness of society might narrow the path to discovery. And he also said that understanding the principles in nature is a good enough reason, in his opinion. What else I really appreciated about this interview, and I really recommend you watching it in full, is that they were both so humble. And just by the plain fact that they shared the Nobel Prize, when Yamanaka could have said, no, I worked 13 years for this one, why should I? But they both are such humble people and scientists. It's really, really inspiring. And they're also very humble about their own contributions and work, because they praise their students and postdocs and everybody that positively influenced the discovery, and they emphasize greatly the importance of inspiring and uplifting role models, because both of them said that they received this kind of mentoring from their supervisors, and they strive to do the same with their postdocs or PhDs or other students that worked in the lab. Which maybe leads me to the conclusion of this episode. What did we learn today? Maybe that elite schools have also stupid teachers, and if you didn't win a Nobel Prize, it's because of your supervisor who wasn't inspiring enough. No, I'm joking. Maybe just a little. But seriously now, I think the conclusion for me is that although Sir Gurdon was privileged in many aspects, he came from a good family, they did have wealth, he was always sent to private schools, which even now is a really big deal, and he had all this going on for him. He still, I think, had to overcome difficult obstacles. He could have just given up. He could have never retake science and just give up on his dreams and passions. Just because one teacher, or actually several teachers, even later decided to break his spirit in a way or another and be petty and, destroy the humanity in someone. It's not even that you believe that someone is not fit for a job. This for me felt also personal, and I don't think that's ever okay. And it can change someone's life forever in a probably very bad way. But even when he put an emphasis on the fact that his mother was there for him and she also supported him to do what he wanted, still I think it's very important to see that he also believed a lot in himself, but in a humble way. Not that he was the smartest or the best person or scientist that ever lived, but he was confident enough in himself that he said, you know what, I really want to do this, and I'm just going to do it. And the fact that he persisted time and time again, despite the disapproving attitude other academic authorities displayed towards him, is very inspiring for me. And although through his interview might have come across maybe a bit arrogant, I think he actually expressed genuine gratitude towards the people that did support him. I think that is a great point to take with you. And this is, gratitude, I think, is a very important thing to have in life. I think that gratitude eases the burden of success and failure, and it prevents a toxic ego inflation from clouding one's judgment and someone's pure curiosity. He had and chose great models and openly admitted that this was immeasurably beneficial for him in his life and career. And from where I stand, he clung to his passion and exercised the right amount of rebellion against authority to fulfill his dreams, and got outside of the box where he was forcefully put in. And the way he sees scientific pursuit was also very balanced, and I wish more scientists would have it. In his opinion, there is no bad experiment. There are only people that put their ego before the truth. And I personally think that only an open-minded person is able to understand the rules of nature's game. We just need to learn how to play it. At the end, I would like to add some details on Sir Gurdon's personal life, because as the title of the podcast is, it's still very important to look at the humanity of someone. And I like to highlight how different scientists can be from, the image projected in people's minds by media and, other stereotypes and misconception. Because the way he saw himself is quite interesting. He called himself the ultimate non-intellectual. So you've heard, boys and girls, no bookworm over here, or a friendless, quirky nerd that a lot of people see in movies. He openly admitted he never goes to the theater or musical performances, and he hates reading books. I was shocked. But you know what? He's so comfortable with himself that he just admitted it. Especially when he was probably always around very intellectual people and elitist. Eton, it's full of elitist people and so on, and Oxford, I don't even need to get into that. But he is so himself that he just didn't care, and he just admitted it. I love it. And he said, well, with the time thereby saved by, doing weird stuff like reading books, he just exercised, and he went skiing, and he continued playing squash and tennis. And throughout his life, he has traveled a lot, and he also liked to climb up mountains and discover nature in general. He was a very outdoorsy person. And even now, at 80 and something, he still hasn't fully retired. So he's still active. Maybe if he inspired you, you can send him a really nice letter. Ask him what is the secret to a long life. Apparently not reading books, probably. Who knows? He also married and had 2 children. And yes, for a very long time he was a professor at Oxford in developmental biology in the zoology department. So folks, I hope this pilot episode inspired or at least entertained you. If not, I hope whatever you did while listening to me turned out good. If that didn't happen either, don't sue me, because the most valuable thing I possess is the capacity to overthink. And believe me when I tell you that you do not want that. So, next time, I will tell you about a pioneering woman engineer who you'll probably never heard of before. So please leave some feedback, and I really hope you enjoyed it. I sure I did. And see you next time. Bye.